Welcome to everybody. We're now going to speak about representation as one of the main themes for the conference, but we'll speak about other terms through it. And I'm very glad that we have here really four very interesting talks that allow us to see different terms from different countries and different contexts, and to try and see how can we think about all of them and really share the knowledge that is that we can learn from one another in this way. So we're going to speak about the terms in this frame of representation. And I think representation, what's interesting about this term is that when you look it up in the dictionary, is that it says that it's to show something on behalf of someone. And I think this kind of reference to doing something on behalf of someone, or whether you're doing it to behalf of someone else or you're doing it on behalf of yourself, and the way that you're using this term is very, very interesting in the papers that we're going to hear, because I think each one has this kind of this game between actors, who is represented, how it is represented, and so on, and how the housing questions are the term itself is being represented is very interesting. So I'm not going to speak a lot about myself. I'm going to give the stage now for the papers. And we're going to start with Jesse. And so I'll just share the screen, and afterwards, I see that I need to open just a moment. I'll go to where it is. Yes, it is. Just a moment. Here it is. Okay, before I'll just stop for a moment the presentation, and I'll just introduce Jesse. Okay.
In the first issue,
just a moment. I'll just introduce Jesse. Jesse Lockard is a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago's Department of Art History, specializing in 20th century architecture and art, with special interest in visual rhetorics and image transmission in the historiography of material culture. Her dissertation, titled From the Ground Up, Joanna Friedman and the Post-War Reimagining of Architecture, examines the work of the French-Hungarian architect Joanna Friedman, examining the ethics and internationalist politics of housing and mobility in the post-war era, and Friedman's distinctive visual modes of architecture theorizing, research supported by the Grant Foundation Carter Manny Award, among other fellowships. Jess has published on the role of architecture theory and photography in the formation of formalism theory, and on archaeology and state formation in 1930s Palestine. She was part of the IIS research group that produced the conference, and as of January, she will be a postdoctoral researcher affiliated with the Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence and the Max Planck Institute. So I will give the stage to Jesse, and we'll see her.
in the first issue of the newly inaugurated newsletter, Postbox for the Development of Habitat, the Dutch architect.
Well,
yes.
We can't see the video.
You can't see the video? So, okay, I'll try again. Okay.
More directed at development.
Just a moment. It's on the, you can't see it, so I'll do share again.
We see your file, your.
Okay, so just a moment. I'll try to. Okay. I'll stop share. Okay, and I'll open it again.
You might have to open the thing before you start the share, I found.
Yes, okay, so it's okay. So let's do it again. And I'm going to the, okay, I'm going to the Zoom.
In the first issue of the newly
Oh,
inaugurated
it's,
Postbox for the development.
yes, I'll just fit, okay. Okay, and we're here, and I'm doing the share screen. Where is this? Why is it not open? I apologize. I'll do it again. I'll open it up again. Okay. Do you see it now? No? Okay, so go back.
In the first issue of the newly inaugurated
It's like,
We'll all remember the first line
yes,
for a long
yes,
time.
yes. I apologize. I don't know why it's not working.
That's quite all right.
I'll just go out.
Zoom and sharing is never
Yeah, it's not working that
move.
well. And let's do escape. And just a moment. Okay, I will open it from here. Okay, this is open. And I'll go back to the share screen. Share screen.
In the first issue of the newly inaugurated newsletter, Postbox for the development of Habitat.
Is it working?
It's working great, but if you could
Okay, I'll take it back. Okay.
In the first issue of the newly inaugurated newsletter, Postbox for the development of Habitat, the Dutch architect Yakima wrote that now that Siam has been declared over, the interests of the modern movement are no more only directed at the development of modern architecture, but more at the development of total habitat. Yakima proposed if you are confronted with problems concerning habitat and you would like to confront them with other colleagues,
Raphael,
Yes.
the sound is really bad.
It sounds really bad.
It's very hard to follow.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's on one. So I'll try to share it again. Stop share.
Should I share it from my computer?
Yes, you can. You can. Maybe it's something. So I'll just finish here. Okay, I'll just close it. Okay, you can share it from your computer, and I'll try to see what's going wrong with the others. Okay. I'll make you a co-host.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Defir, did you have the button pushed to share the computer sound?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay, huh.
So,
That usually helps.
okay. Okay, maybe. Okay. So can you share it, Jesse?
I think so. Let's try. Can you all see it?
Yes.
And sometimes there's a background noise.
In the first issue of his newly inaugurated newsletter, Postbox for the development of Habitat, the Dutch architect Yakima wrote that now that Siam has been declared over, the interests of the modern movement are, quote, no more only directed at the development of modern architecture, but more at the development of total human habitat. Yakima proposed if you are confronted with problems concerning habitat and you would like to confront them with other colleagues, send me plans, texts, photos. He would summarize and disseminate with a slightly unclear aim of, quote, to develop architecture and town planning towards a language which can communicate about human behavior. Yakima was marking, in a way, the cracks that would become the rift between architecture and the provision of housing that animates this conference, using on the one side modern architecture and on the other side habitat. I found some issues of Yakima's multilingual newsletter among the papers of the architect Joanna Friedman after his recent death. EPH, as the newsletter was known, was one of these early sites in which Friedman had advertised his manifestos. As a Friedman researcher, I was interested in this kind of primary source arena for debate. I knew well that the words Friedman used, like mobile, Megastructure, habitat, cluster gained rhetorical efficacy through repetition and widespread reuse, though in all cases they have been personalized. But among these terms, habitat remained oddly ambiguous to me. BPH caught my eye for that reason. Habitat had been, after all, a dominant term in Western architectural culture since at least the late 40s. What, at this point, did it develop? Habitat as a language? Bakima suggested that the common language would be fostered in a illustrated communication paper, quote unquote. Words are left on their own, organized that reflected what the process of a proper architectural debate looked like at that moment to him. Names of men, nation states, keywords, summaries written in French or in English or German. Taking a lead from Bakima, I chose the word habitat as a test case for my research today because it is unmissable in housing terminology. Its popularity and endurance is paired with an oddly polysemous character in a continual and rapid evolution. From the mid-50s to the mid-70s, habitat accrued some of the progressive and humanitarian associations that echo in contemporary popular usage, habitat for humanity, etc. But how did the term evolve from what Neutra used it to say here on the left? A word one could draw on to talk about a villa designed by a master, meaning something like dwelling in a holistically curated life, to a term connoting the types of crises in human settlement that required international solidarity. Modernist homes, single client, and the promise of shelter for masses all over the world. By the mid-60s, I propose this type of pattern.
Sorry, I think there was a problem with the sound. I tried to mute myself. I'll go back a little bit.
An important link, I argue, is found in the central image on your screen. This would have been a familiar kind of image and pattern, and I think it's a visually articulated link between modernist home, single client, and the promise of shelter for masses all over the world. By the mid-60s, I propose, this type of pattern would have meant habitat just as clearly as the printed word on top of it. Importantly, this kind of visual keyword, which sustains a compositional tension between individuated units and massive collective forms, is easily analogized to political formations and helped shape the meaning of the word habitat into what we hear when we say it today. To offer a sense of broader stakes, consider the transnational legibility that pictorial keywords would have had or would have seemed to offer in the post-war moment of triumphant internationalism, promising a way to blur or overcome regional difference in service of a global universalist conversation without succumbing to linguistic babel or to just English. Fundamentally, this paper considers how mistranslations and transmissions between word and image, just like between languages, cultures, and disciplines, formed our architectural terminology. And I focus specifically here on photography. Just as communication in a conversation is, of course, produced with gestures as well as words, the language of architecture is, of course, riven with visual and material signals without which the linguistic discourse is only partially coherent. Thus, it is telling, for example, that among the same Friedman papers where I found Bakima's newsletter, I found dozens of glassine envelopes holding negatives sent to Friedman by architects from all over during the 1960s in his capacity as a leader of an avant-garde network. As part of his role of fostering debate and facilitating communication of ideas, he printed photos, reformatted, rephotographed, duplicated, resent elsewhere. He altered pictures by hand, and that's a Tange photograph, or to fit publication needs for the group. This is their first publication. Or adapting the pictures people sent him into exhibition poster format, and there's Frei Otto and Günter Gutenschel, for example. Or he photomechanically manipulated images to turn models into patterns, which were more useful as visual material. And here you see, for example, native photographs of a model and its publication in a Japanese journal. These are the strips of photographs, here a printed negative, that collage was made of, which Friedman himself sent to others like Archigram and so on, and where they found their way into other people's visual lexicons. My point is simply that there was a swiftly circulating ecology of photographic material on the move that formed a visual equivalent of Bakima's Postbox. As we attend to the development of architectural theory and professional terminology, we gain from thinking of visual and linguistic rhetoric in tandem. What happens when we start to think of a picture module like this one in the same way we do as a linguistic term? One thing is that a collage such as this one by Archigram becomes an entry dictionary made by architects for architects. It's all about cognates, emphasizing a sense of canon building sameness. But it's kind of a false sameness. Because while projects like Isozaki's Cluster City or Sakti's Habitat, which you can see here, are designs for buildings and complexes that look like they are made of agglomerations, Friedman's models are attempting to visualize a way of doing architecture that reneges on form, ceding the right to design buildings to those who use them. In fact, in Friedman, whenever you see little rectangles, you should be interpreting them not as shapes, but as an X in an algebraic equation standing in for an unknown and unknowable form. Here, visual likeness, here, and I mean in these collages, visual likeness is deployed to obscure conceptual difference. And that is the kind of formative mistranslation that allows a keyword to function in multiple languages, meaning different but close enough things, kind of like the word habitat in French and in English. Habitat is a term that splits the 20th century in two, quite literally. This is a diagram drawn by Le Corbusier in a letter to Siam's Congress of '56 at Dubrovnik. The diagram aims to prophesize or dictate modern architectural history. On the left, vaguely, is the 20th century. The vertical line is paradigm shift. Le Corbusier sets up a schema that separates the founders, quote unquote, of the modern movement from those, quote, who achieve. Once the founders had established a program, the achievers were charged with making sure doctrine went, quote, global in practice. These old new aims were to be codified as a charter of habitat. Now, this diagram helps explain the charge carried by the term habitat. Whatever was on the other side of the historical line was called habitat before it even arrived. And as the replacement of the Athens Charter, it was declared correct before it was even born. The term was freighted with the ethics and future responsibilities of the profession in the wake of the Second World War. Remember Bakima the development of modern architecture on one side and the development of total human habitat on the other. Now, this Siam history is likely to be largely familiar. What might be more of a surprise is that from the moment in 1947, when Le Corbusier suggested habitat as the title for the update, an international argument raged in slow motion for nearly 2 decades over the definition of the word habitat. Everybody wanted their own version of what the word meant to win out, because hitching your ideas to a ride on the teleological line of history propelled by Le Corbusier's little. An exasperated Siegfried Gideon sent out English and French definitions accompanied by warning that the council will have no time at its disposal to plunge again about words. Raged on, regardless. At one point, the council suggested that the word habitat is difficult to translate into English, but accepted that it meant something, quote, larger than housing and smaller than neighborhoods, in other words, the setting of daily human life. Others emphasized ecological definitions about plants and animals and their favorite spots. Some took literally the extrapolation of habitat from housing, dwelling. Others linked the term to the recent Declaration of the Universal Rights of Man. Despite any conceptual ambiguity, or I would argue perhaps because of it, habitat functioned as a performative category of resistance and critique, as well as a conservative alignment, and way of performing continuity. It was a term that was a flexible but effective ideological locator, rather than a word that was particularly good at conveying something precise. Indeed, Gideon even admitted as much, writing in 53 that habitat is an old, quote, and partly forgotten term, excellently suited for the intentions of Cyan. It was a word that was originally chosen for its capacity to remain fuzzily potent without being too specific as it crossed countries and languages. And that's why it's interesting to think about how, at a certain point, even though architects may not have agreed on what habitat meant, by the 60s, they knew it when they saw it. It needed pictures to pin it down. Of course, Moshe Safdie's Habitat 67 makes the joining of pattern and term plain to see. But as Rainer Banham acerbically remarked, Habitat 67 was a perfect example of the work of architects who saw their task, quote, as being the proposal of urban structures of the future in which a modern high-tech society could construct its own equivalent of spontaneous group form by natural accretion and reconstruction. We called this a memorial sculpture to folk urbanism. Banham had famously made his mark by a historian by calling out the chasm between functionalism actual buildings and the, quote, mythological character of much of what the modern movement believes about itself. He then proceeded to do the same for the 60s. Now, this collective self-mythology of Safdie-type architecture, these memorial sculptures, was largely fed by photographs of non-Western vernacular architecture, pictures of groups of houses, and Banham uses these same photographs in his megastructure book. Having said all this, my title term is not habitat, but rather group form, which was a less ubiquitous, though still popular term that the Japanese metabolist Fumiko Maki defined in 1962 as a sequential, spontaneous development of architectural elements with no apparent beginning or end. Maki argued, quote, that we lack an adequate visual language for the built environment with which the post-war architect has to cope. Quote, the visual and physical concepts at our disposal have to do with single buildings and with closed compositional means for organizing them, end quote. Maki offered a couple approaches to this visual language, but of these categories, group form is the one that looks most to historical examples and thus to photographs of the world rather than drawing boards, which made the ways in which images circulate internal to the definition of the term, which is why I chose it. And here you see an early draft of Maki's text in Bakima's newsletter. But what is crucial here is that Maki was already offering a visual language. The photographs of vernacular architecture that he used became part of the dictionary of post-war visual rhetoric. Let's follow this visual lexicon. Maki is using pictures that would that year also appear in Bernard Rudowski's blockbuster MoMA exhibition of vernacular architecture, which I'm sure you all know, mostly from the Global South, Architecture Without Architects. And Rudowski uses pictures that explicitly refer back to the visual language of metabolist collective form, offering it a visual prehistory. Rudowski's exhibition, in turn, was culled from the archives of ethnographic museums, tourism offices, architectural journals, ethnographic surveys, fertilizing architectural visual rhetoric with that of other disciplines. Rudowski's labels and pictures are littered with unmistakable and specific references to habitat discourse. He describes Moroccan fortresses, for example, as, quote, neither house nor town, but a synthesis of both. This architecture was conceived by people who built according to their inner light and uncheered imagination. In doing so, Rudowski bestowed upon habitat discourse a legitimizing usable past, and the antecedents he offered were swiftly adopted. Photographs of architecture without architects from the catalog began appearing in experimental architectural magazines, books, and collages very soon after its publication. They continued to be appropriated throughout the 70s and are found seemingly everywhere one looks. And here's what I meant a little bit about the visual history. You find reprints of dogon villages from Rudowski and Lloyd Kahn's Shelter. You find appropriated pictures of domes in Safdie's Beyond Habitat. Here are the Wuyu Rao amphitheaters in a super studio slideshow at MoMA in 72, even a presentation of the future of American cities given by architecture students in Missouri in 68 began with a Rudowski photograph of a Zambian village. Nicolas Negroponte used the same picture as Joanna Friedman did in his collage. Even UNESCO. Through this repeated circulation, stability of reference is accumulated. Much of Siam debate over habitat was anchored in the differences between what habitat meant in French and in English. The words are linguistic cognates, close enough to feel coherent, alike, but not quite the same. In post-war architectural culture, words that resonated in different languages through processes of borrowing, colonial entrenchments, and other twists were valued as kinds of ready-made Esperanto, moments of seeming transparency between cultures, textual or visual, and were crucial building blocks of post-war internationalism, even if they encoded and recorded webs of mistranslation, misunderstanding, primitivism, racism, paternalism, white supremacy, and a whole range of biases I left out of this talk. Historian Mark Mazauer recounts that, quote, the dream of a universal language was characteristic of late 19th century confidence in the potential of internationalism. While philosophers and linguists sought to uncover the underlying structures and forms common to all languages, others called for the creation of a single new language available for world use. Artificial languages like Esperanto and Ido, as well as universal codes and standards, were seen as antidotes to bellicose nationalism. As the habitat definition debate raged, architects around the globe collectively built up such a universal post-war, anti-war, perhaps, language, perhaps an architectural antidote to bellicose nationalism. Not sure about that, but it's a question. What's for sure is that it wasn't so much French or English, but rather pictures and patterns. Thank you.
Sophia, you're muted.
Yes, thank you.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Jesse. And you can please just go out from the share screen. And we're opening now the floor for questions. We'll do like 15 minutes after each presentation. So does anybody wants to ask something or to remark?
I have a question, Jesse. I was really struck by, I guess maybe sort of push on something you mentioned that you have not addressed. So, which is all the exclusions, all the things that are not addressed in all of this. But what I'm wondering about is, I found really this, the idea of a ready-made Esperanto, of this sort of constructed, fabricated language to try to connect all these different practices and ideas to try to create some sort of unified, I don't know if I would be interested how you would qualify. Is it a movement? Is it a concept? But I was also thinking about what you were saying pretty early on in the paper about this slippage of Joanna Friedman's images and the way those images look so much like, you know, Tasaki's and so many other images, but yet they represent for him completely different things. This is not about form, it's about a concept and, you know, a structure, not like a physical structure, but a, you know, conceptual structure. So I'm wondering about the slippages that you get through representation, whether it's graphic representation. So sorry, there's people trying to leave my house right now.
Internet on Epic. Epic doesn't have any internet at all.
So sorry. So these slippages between graphic languages as well as linguistic representations, and then exclusions. And is there maybe some connection in there? Who and what was excluded from all these ideas and the slippages?
Well, thank you for these many great questions. I will do my best. Where shall I start? I guess I can take a step back and say that in a way, this project, which is just a beginning kind of putting together some ideas really, is anchored in something that that as I was writing about Friedman started to bother me more and more, where I found a deep disjunction between what I understood the images that I was looking at, these like very complicated montages, to be doing and saying, and what the texts that they were supposedly illustrating what the texts were saying, right? So there was this disjunction between word and image that I started to find I started to think of as kind of almost formative for Friedman's practice, right? And that has led me to kind of think of that more broadly and see, wait, okay, if this is going on here, maybe it's going on, you know, elsewhere. And wait, of course, architects theorize visually. It's what, you know, what they do. And then why are we continuing to think, when we are talking about theory and kind of architectural philosophy, why do we always prioritize text when we're dealing with a practice that is so very good at working with images, right? And so, and then why are we also assuming that the text and the words are saying the same thing when they can't possibly be doing that in a way? And so, and that's kind of the background for my for this particular project. So after that kind of, I guess, research question developed, then I started to kind of try to understand ways in which, like, why would there be differences, right? What were the images doing actively that couldn't quite be done in the language, because the language needed to do something else? And so the kind of, what I saw that archigram collage doing, I think that, you know, canon building and movement building in particular, which is, and I take movement building to be an attempt to make yourself into canon, right? Very often, is all about creating a sometimes false sense of unity, right? And so the idea that you could do that visually in a way that was really very effective. I mean, if you look at that collage, it all, you see immediately the kind of the relationships between these very different projects, right? It seems very coherent. Now, of course, once you start actually looking at how that image is constructed, you see that in one case it's cropped so dramatically that you're actually seeing only the corner of a building, whereas everything else is something completely different. In another, it's you know, Xerox so dramatically that the contrast actually creates a pattern that doesn't exist in the object, and so forth, right? And so then there are these multiple layers of image manipulation that are actually at play in creating very successfully an architectural canon that then gets carried on, for example, in, you know, Banham's writing on the period, right? So this back and forth. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if I got to everything you said, but so that's, I guess, one thing. And then this question of the Esperanto is something that that came basically from a slightly different angle of trying to understand the ways in which the architects I was looking at really didn't quite fit into nation state categories, where, and again, I'm trained in art history, and just incredibly bound still by nation state disciplinary bounds. And, you know, I couldn't, if somebody asked me, do you work on French architecture? I could never say yes, but I couldn't say I work on Hungarian architecture or on, like, there is the kind of nation state model doesn't work. So then what does internationalism look like? And then what does internationalism look like? How is it forming itself visually? Then became a very central question. And mistranslation, just as in language, I think visually was something that they were playing with very explicitly in trying to think about how to create these kinds of internationalist coherencies. I don't know if that answered your question somewhat, except the erasures. I didn't answer about the erasures, but maybe I'll leave that aside for a minute.
That's fine.
Are there more questions? Just jumping. I wanted to say, I think what's interesting what I feel from what we saw is that there is a kind of a detachment, which is a detachment also in the way that these photographs are expressed. Most of them are like very far, taken from very far, and they show like things as a kind of accumulation of something that you see in microscopes almost. And on the other end, this detachment is real because part of it is looking on other cultures, which are not the cultures of the looker, of the one who looks at them. And also they are detached in a way from the words, because like words like habitat are dealing with, as if you're looking at a kind of a animal surrounding and you're exploring into it, but actually what the pictures are doing are looking at it not as a habitat of a mammal or something like this. It's like looking at it as if it's like microbes or something that you look at on a Petri dish or something like this. So can you say something about this detachment from what is like, because of habitat, of course, comes from the realm of good words, like yes, we're doing a good habitat for people, but the detachments of there is the detachments of the look, of the gaze. So can you refer to it?
Absolutely, and I will refer to it by actually answering as well the part of Sharon's question that I didn't get to. I've been thinking of it less as detachment and more as abstraction, but I understand. But I think we're talking about the same phenomenon in a way. I've been thinking about it as abstraction because I'm thinking about what kind of image manipulations are happening to create very particular political effects, right? Or to reflect, but I think to create. And I think that, and this is another, yes, let's see how to put it. There's multiple directions to take it, but I can start by saying that one of the things that when I started writing about Rudovsky in particular, or just looking through the history of that exhibition, I was really interested in the fact that it actually was built up in out of two corpuses of photographs that were collected, of vernacular architecture that were collected at different moments. And the photographs that I showed you were actually all from the second collection. The earlier collection was almost 20 years before Rudovsky had tried to have this this exhibition staged, and MoMA said no. But he had already collected these photographs that had the role of actually proving, basically, that that the modern movement had its roots in the forms of, say, the Greek village and so forth, right? So you have these kinds of images that are much more Corbusian or whatever, where you have these geometric that where kind of pattern, or where built environments are kind of abstracted to emphasize, to do away with local difference and emphasize a kind of universality of geometric form, right? And so there's that kind of body of imagery, and then there's the additional body of imagery that he added in the 60s, which is what I was focused on more here, which then was trying to, by then architectural culture had shifted so much, his alignments were no longer with this modernist rhetoric that he was trying to, that he was kind of engage with, and with the new kind of 60s habitat discourse, right? And so then an entirely different kind of vernacular architecture presents itself, and a different type of treatment of these images comes into play. And that treatment is exactly this kind of a lot of wartime imagery from aerial photography, right? So you also think about how these images were produced in the first place when you're thinking about the detachment. And that's the kind of thing when I'm talking about bringing in these different kinds of visual rhetoric. The visual rhetoric that we're seeing in a lot of these images is produced by war, right? A lot of these photographs were taken from during aerial warfare, right? Or aerial surveys of enemy territory and so forth, right? But then reconfigured into an architectural lexicon, right? But of course they bring with them, they carry with them a certain relationship, a certain detachment to the subject of the image, of course, right? And so there's a kind of politics to to the image itself and how it was produced that you can't get rid of, right? And so the relationships, the ways in which these spaces have no people, of course, ways of living are not, particularities of people's ways of living are not actually interesting, because you're not actually interested in the people themselves. You're actually interested in a kind of Western idea of a kind of forms of life that get theoretically, through in this primitivist lens, preserved perfectly, right? But it's not preserved perfectly because this is just a, an instance, a kind of contingent example, and what you need to get to is actually the essential form, and that essential form in this kind of built environment would be a pattern, not the kind of geometric shapes of the earlier modernist architecture, but in the case of non-Western built environments, we're talking about patterns, right? And so then you see these photographs that are not only erased of people and of context and so forth, but actually just really turned into, through all kinds of photographic manipulations, literal patterns, right? But then also you can understand how if you do that and you create a pattern, that pattern can then be knit together theoretically into a kind of global image of a universal humanity or something like that, right? And in putting it in terms of that period. Yeah, I hope that answered.
Other questions also? Or comments?
Yeah, I would like. I would like to raise a question whether these forms or patterns that are basically an emergent behavior, they're not planned behavior, as each individual instance of them is planned, but the texture itself is emergent. Are there, is the design field even capable of having anything to say about them? Because the act of design is contradictory to emergent behavior. The moment one person designs a thing, well, you can say about planning can be connected to it, but design maybe not so much. I think, maybe, it's a question.
I don't know that I can answer that question. I can say that in the rhetoric of that period, there was a definite split between what parts of the world and what cultures were understood as having the capacity to emergent, kind of uncontrolled emergent behavior, and or as in some of the texts I was quoting, spontaneous construction, right? Spontaneous form, and what and who could, see themselves in a different way and have the capacity to overcome this kind of spontaneity, and at that point would have to just kind of reflect on it through these, or what Banham would call, memorial sculptures. But so I guess my answer is that because this has been such a fraught discourse that is riven with racism to such a deep degree for the past 100 years at least in architectural theory, I find it very difficult to say kind of yes or no to your answer, except to say to your question, except to say we have to look at it very carefully, and anytime we read about it, we have to read it very carefully with that in mind, and similarly every time we look at it, as in these books, and we have to do it very carefully. And I think part of what interested me to see was the ways in which things that we don't feel like we have to look at with the same care, such as experimental Brits in the 60s, actually are participating in this far more problematic and complicated, politically charged historiography.
I would just like to add that when I was a student of architecture in the 1990s, these books and these images were still very strong, and they were part of the idea of design. The idea was that if you want to do something which is connected to the place and locality, you should look it up through these books. Of course, there was no critical approach to these books. It was like, oh, it shows something which is almost like a handbook to understand how you can do something which is authentic.
Right.
And so it was like really without any criticism, and in Israel it was very, very common to be referred by your teachers to these books.
Well, I think that, for example, certain types of cluster composition in architectural design today are still, and if we talk about housing, for example, are still very much connected to that kind of history, right? And still and maintain the kind of progressive political association that habitat discourse developed, right? And that kind of contemporaneity of this as a design practice, and that's still linked to kind of ideas of regionalism or localism, makes, for me, this history that I'm tracking kind of more important to do carefully and now.
Okay, thank you.
Well, so may I have just a remark? It's not a question, but the more I'm thinking about the whole lecture, and I would like to join partly to Sharon's comment, so that what I missed from this presentation, that Jesse didn't mention the technical background of these projects, because at the same time when we can join them to the problem of the language, to the problem of the recently and mainly thanks to Rudowski's invented or reinvented vernacular architecture, at this period of the 60s and the the second part of the 60s and mainly in the 60s and the early 70s as well, the technological and the techniques itself was very important. So usually I interpret this period of architecture for myself, that architects who more or less became disappointed with modern movement and the functionalism of modern movement, now they somehow found a new means to produce something which can be much more connected to the vernacular, to the advantages of vernacular, and at the same time with the help of technology.
I will agree with you completely, and in fact, I think and my focus really on photography here and how images move was both as a kind of answer to the terminological focus of this conference, but I absolutely agree that this kind of research is one side of the coin, and the other side is the technological, both in terms of how high tech or let's say if we go back to kind of Banham's critique of functionalism, that it had all the aesthetics of the machine, but none of the building practice, none of the technology, right? We're talking about a moment in which those construction technologies were actually coming into effect, right? And so then there's this shift. So then just to say that the kind of tension between these incoming construction technologies and then the types of images that they were being wrapped around, I think is absolutely crucial to this kind of research. That said, I will again refer to Banham, just because what you're describing to me is kind of aligned with a kind of megastructuralist part of this canon. Banham himself at a certain point started to say, well, things look like megastructures, they look like technology. Some of them are technology, but actually that difference between what a mega vision is or what a mega aesthetic is, that conversation is actually, he called the megastructural conversation, is actually that something that's produced through images as they circulate around the world. It's a visual conversation. And sometimes it meets the actual building technologies and sometimes it doesn't. And so to me, that again makes just kind of separating out that what that visual conversation was and how it actually functioned in practice kind of worthwhile. But this is all to say that I agree, I take your comment and I agree with it.
Thank you. Another question? Okay, so thank you, Jesse. And we'll go now for the second presentation by Marcelo or Marcelo? Marcelo, I said Marcelo Sagot better. Marcelo Sagot better is a PhD candidate at the Bauhaus University in Weimar, Germany, and also in the Blekinge Tekniska Hochschule in Sweden. His dissertation topic is permanent exhibitions and the specularization of housing culture in European urbanism, 100 years of reforming capitalism. Is an early stage researcher at the European Union Horizon 2020, research and innovation in the Marie Sklodowska-Curie action, and is a master in architecture in this, and he has a master in architecture and special planning from Cardiff University, the UK, and Radboud University, Nijmegen in the Netherlands. So Sharon, if you can help me and open Marcelo's talk.
Yes, so you want me to share it?
Yes.
Okay. And everyone tell me that that's going okay.
Good afternoon, my name is Marcelo Sagot-Better. I will be presenting as part of the chair on representation and the specific terminology of sustainability. The name of the following presentation is Sustainability as Design Terminology, the case of the Bonnet-led exhibition in Malmö, Housing and Mediation. Decisive planning policies implemented during the 20th century led to a historical process of democratization of housing in Sweden. Nevertheless, the equality and inclusiveness achieved as a result of the implementation of national housing initiatives like the Million Programme started to fade away during the 1980s. This was a direct result of the declining heavy industry and the oil crisis. Consequently, post-industrial areas became an additional challenge for all major cities around the world. The following contribution elaborates on the specific case of Malmö, the third largest city in Sweden, and to what extent the redevelopment strategy implemented in 2001 adopted the term sustainability as more than a concept to legitimize the housing exhibition in the Western Harbor. With this specific case, I am aiming not to only explore the relation between theory and practice, but to delve on a more general phenomenon, the allure of coupling sustainable terminology and architectural practice. In order to further explore the implications of this problem area, I propose to take a look on the use of the word for the first time in planning policy. Officially, sustainability emerged as part of the report Our Common Future in 1987. The report elaborated on the nature of the ongoing crisis and the interlocking responsibilities of all the countries. It made a categorical distinction between sustainable and unsustainable development as a desirable and harmful path for humanity. Likewise, declining heavy industry and shipyard services in Malmö forced the city authorities to reevaluate the development path of the city, continuing developing housing in an old-fashioned or adopting the goals of sustainability. Let us assume that housing discourses in the wake of similar phenomena often favor visions of reactivation and redevelopment of neglected areas, the so-called brownfields, for example. At the same time, These tend to adopt contested terminology to theoretically validate an architectural response. Accordingly, the city's so-called reorientation strategy stipulated to move away from the notion of industrial port city towards a more dynamic and environmental urban area. The flagship project of this process of transformation was the development of a housing exhibition that represented the city's turn to the new millennium. Nevertheless, the housing estate development for the occasion of the exhibition, acting as a mediator of sustainable design, aimed to open a debate between the present and the future. In other words, how we live today and how we will live tomorrow. Despite the many political and economic setbacks, the exhibition opened in the Western Harbor, and it has been a referent of housing exhibitions and sustainable development. According to its official catalog, the development of the new urban district was set to create an ideal example of housing environment while showcasing to the world how the natural environment could be adjusted to a densely developed central areas. Nevertheless, the evaluation report of the exhibition expressed that while displaying housing certainly created a good role model for future projects, it was, however, what distinguished from a non-sustainable one. The concept of sustainability is a very difficult concept to define. Evaluation of which took place during the construction process and what of the new residential area is, therefore, a necessity to be able to take advantage of good ideas. The reality for the specific case of the exhibition, as well for housing in general, is that architects, planners, and politicians often sought sustainability in different and ambiguous ways. The problem becomes particularly evident when trying to evaluate the outcomes of this type of development efforts. In order to make a picture clear of this kind of difficulties or dilemmas, one might refer to the words of Christopher Alexander that artificial order is not necessarily self-correcting, or maybe it is on a generational time scale, so individuals are not going to notice it. As a result, human beings cannot do the natural environment and build buildings and structures that damage the world. It is not easy to diagnose what is good and distinguish it from what is bad. Consequently, I argue that if none can clearly define the term sustainability, and in exchange it is not possible, or at least not ideal, to measure it or evaluate it, we need to ask, what are the reasons for embracing the term not only as an intrinsic aspect of housing exhibitions for the vision of Malmö, but even more problematic, why architecture adopt the term at all? In order to answer in the first query, one could be limited to take a look on the strain of historical circumstances that led to the complex political and economic agenda favoring the adoption and communication of the term during the exhibition. Whereas such a simplistic implementation does not include the mediating role of the exhibition, not only conveying but reshaping contested interpretation of sustainability through housing. Consequently, I argue that approaching this dilemma requires of a deeper reflection on both the ontological and epistemological perspectives of sustainability, which are in a simpler way understanding the term as what it is and what it does. Namely, an abstract, simplified view of the world and a discourse that shapes material culture. With a simplified view of the world, I refer to the use of the term from a phenomenological perspective, a process of typification and relate to objects in the world. Alfred Schutz explains that the term acts like a label, allowing us to grasp and experience reality, or in this case, the material culture of the housing exhibition, thus eliminating the need to delve deeper into the analysis of meanings. Nonetheless, while typifications allow us to create social reality, These are at the same time constrained by pre-existing social and cultural structures created by others. Schutz argues that these typical constructs are institutionalized as a standard of behavior warranted by both traditional like values or customs and by a specific means of control, discipline. Accordingly, sustainability is part of a system of institutionalized terms as well, one that allows us to grasp upon housing but is constrained by context. For the interpreted purposes of the present discussion, I argue that the term sustainable in the exhibition was meant to be a sort of imprinting, a means to stamp material in order to convey culture, first-hand deductions rather than disclosing deeper meanings that stand behind the term. Therefore, the term sustainability can be approached not only as a legitimizing process of decisions taken by planners, designers, and politicians, but also a curated terminology selected to contour the message on display without the need of further decodification. Nonetheless, it is also possible to elaborate on an opposite perspective, that is, taking into consideration the ambiguity of the definition or the lack of one as an element of sustainability that creates selfhood or identity. For instance, one may argue that the use of a specific terminology in housing often comes to support the uniqueness of architectural ideas. In the case of the Bonnelet exhibition, this assumption took the shape of a model housing estate that is different to others because it's sustainable, and those epithets like the first, the best, or the greenest come at hand when describing something so atypical. In this sense, the term sustainable was exploited to typify or categorize the exhibition material concept, namely buildings, catalogs, printed media, and official documentation, relying on a specific terminology to shape the meaning of the exhibition and attribute uniqueness. A common platform to achieve the best neighborhood built in 2001. That was the point that the insight and the need of building ecological, sustainable information and welfare society was referred in the quality program in 1999. Constrained within the pressure of capitalism and market economy, sustainability is often weaponized for profit, following a well-known discourse of exclusivity and ownership. As such, I argue that sustainability became the most attractive option to convey an image and contribute to architectural value to the housing typologies of the exhibition. To this point, we can conclude with a final discussion. Firstly, I would like to introduce the idea of sustainability as the capacity to perpetuate demand. That is, that the basic need for human habitation makes housing the subject of a perpetual demand. Nevertheless, not everyone needs architecture. Just in the United States, not more than 1/4 of the built environment has ever required architects, and only 1 in 10 houses have. I argue that architectural practices often create their own demandization and self-labeling, like sustainable, for instance. Myriad of artifacts, buildings, and urban spaces that look sustainable and makes us feel part of a bigger system in return. Nonetheless, I argue that these more than often come from a dialectical understanding of history and vernacular tradition, and hardly ever from the practice of. According to Nikos Salingaros argues that making buildings requires of a worldview based upon connectivity to natural processes of the positivist interpretation of sustainability has led to mechanicist analysis of architecture. This takes us to the second conclusion, that is sustainability as the synthesis of identity in architecture. The general assumption is that since phenomenological relation between architecture and environment is particularly close in terms of our capacity to easily discern between the cause and the effect, a better environment. Nevertheless, this interpretation on the term involves, while this interpretation of the term environment and economy, I argue that such definition also has the potential to produce the social effect to Salingaros, and that is a part of human nature and ignores one's identity. If we assume that the definition of sustainability that emerged in 1987 was all about making a change in the ways humankind relates to nature, it is also important to review to what extent sustainability makes a change in the ways architecture relates to our identity, not only by exploiting individuality and uniqueness for the sake of consumption, but by taking it as a departing point to convey human nature in and through housing. Sustainability applied this time as a means to achieve the most sensible option to build up one's identity by habitation, while preserving resources for everyone in community is by all means a more desirable approach to the term. The final conclusion is that identity as a framework for sustainability and housing. I argue that in the same way science allows us to create diagnostic tools to evaluate the impact of architecture, we can also use identity as a part of the means or conduits to apprehend what is sustainable housing, not by attributing green points to a good building, but by evaluating how the adoption of this specific terminology affects identity. In other words, how architecture as a body of knowledge aligns with sustainability as a social historical context, and it articulates its discourses in various facets of human culture, of which houses are just one. I consider that overlooking this capacity detaches sustainability from housing and therefore from any architectural project. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Marcelo, for a very interesting paper. And does anybody wants to ask something or comment? So maybe I'll start. I think what was very interesting is that in this conference, we tried to find out how can we use the terms which are related to architecture and reconnect them with housing. The terms like, there is this wrap between housing and architecture, where in a way architecture lost a lot of the terms that were used maybe in the past, or we thought that we were using, and it's not applicable now in the discourse of housing. And I think what's interesting in your paper is that it's a kind of an indictment against architects, that their use of language is a bit false, even we can say that there is a kind of a mechanism of words which means in a way all and nothing, and it's like being used by architects as practitioners to give all kinds of to hide all kinds of very horrible things. So I would like to ask you, do you think there is a way where this kind of language can be used in a way that architecture and architects can say something which is more true? Like, is there like, what was wrong with sustainability which caused this raft that you speak about?
Part of the question, what was wrong with sustainability? That what?
I can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
What was the last part of the question? What was wrong with sustainability? That
yeah. Is there like a way that maybe another way of using this term and applying this term, and can be used in a way which is truthful and and can architects use it in a way that they will become really, let's say, relevant for the case of housing, because in a way your solution was, let's look beyond the architects. And is there a way that we can engage in this process?
Yeah, I think in a way, I mean, what I wanted to propose at the end of the paper was more like a strong statement that, I don't know, that in a way we should try to channel sustainability as a way to convey our identity in buildings and specifically in housing, and I don't know, architecture more as a body of knowledge. And the term sustainability should be something that is articulated in discourses that affect human culture, right? So in a way, for me, houses are just part of this, and I don't know, like seeing sustainability just as a way to justify or to legitimize the development of housing kind of detaches the human aspect of housing. And I think sustainability in a way could be seen as a vehicle or as a means to reattach it. So I don't know, I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer in the same way, because for me it's like a very important issue. It's a major issue in architecture, and to come with a solution in that way would be like, yeah, fantastic. But I mean, I actually really don't know. It was more like an open conclusion, like actually to elaborate more on that. So it's something that I would like to explore more in the future, certainly.
Are there other questions or comments? So I'll just continue. In the way, the trigger for your paper was a permanent exhibition, and we know that permanent exhibitions were often envisaged as a kind of a sustainable way of producing and presenting architecture, whether it's to show technological advancements or social advancement. Do you think here there was a kind of a success also in the fact that this kind of a permanent exhibition was to show the road for housing in the future in Sweden or elsewhere?
Yeah, in a way you can say that from my perspective, the biggest contribution was to create this kind of acceptance of the term and to showcase like an example of, yeah, we can continue developing on this direction, right? It's definitely not the best case study. It's definitely not the best or the most sustainable neighborhood, but in a way they kind of introduce the notion and they open the debate to the Swedish society that this should be like the next path to continue developing. And for me, that's the major contribution of the exhibition. Of course, that you can go deeper into the discussion and see that actually the exhibition was not so inclusive in a way. It's quite they developed a very exclusive neighborhood. They kept excluded like around 40% of the population that could have actually like afford one of the houses there. And so in that case, yeah, they have adopted several strategies, several technologies that make the state very sustainable. But on the other hand, you have very specific political decisions that made it exclusive and made it very elitist. And it's like an open debate still. We continue actually like a major issue in whole Swedish housing economy, because at the end of the day, they continue to rely on private developers to supply housing. And of course, there is speculation and there is competition, and the way the market behaves is often excluding people. So from a social standpoint, you can say that it's completely a failure. But yeah, from a technological standpoint, you can say it's environmentally friendly. So
Yeah.
it's a very open discussion still.
I think part of it is also the idea of using the brownfields, which is, it became like a kind of a world tendency, and it actually builds like totally secluded neighborhoods. And all the idea of what kind of housing is going to be in these secluded neighborhoods is very interesting, and it's one of the challenges that we're working with today.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, in a political level, they kind of have this struggle how to maintain land to be productive in the city. So yeah, they shut down the shipyard services and the industries there, and they had a big plot that was not being productive for the city. And in a way, they come with the idea that, okay, we need to put something there, whatever it is, and continue doing some kind of development in the city, some kind of investment. And at the end of the day, there was no actually like a deeper understanding, or there was not such a deep level of conscious on what was actually needed, or if this particular answer was necessary. So yeah, in a way, there is like this struggle to, okay, we have an open field, we have a brown field, we need to put something there because otherwise it's going to be wasted. And nowadays we have more like more discussions on if this is really like the right path, or we should just leave it there and contribute to the city in another way, right? Not actually building, perhaps.
I don't know, can I?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to.
Sure, goes, yeah.
I guess what I have is just more a comment than a question, which is that I just really appreciate you bringing up framing sustainability as something that's so much more about marketability often than the actual content. And I do think it's a powerful move in general. And I think it's a really important one to interrogate, whether it's in relationship to housing or other types of architectural production. And I think, in part it comes from, I keep thinking about sort of the sessions yesterday about the market that we had, and how terms work in terms of, kind of informing or shaping what the market is and what's marketability. But I think also just this incredible an urgent need for really unpacking and practicing sustainability, and the way that the term almost, gets completely sort of not whitewashed, but sort of diluted when it just becomes a marketing term. So I really appreciate that. And I don't know if you want to expand at all.
Other questions? So I'll just say something and we'll go to the next presentation. We had a very interesting in the last session, which Jesse chaired. We had a presentation about IKEA, and that one of the things, and we spoke about one of the things that you get from their catalogs is a lesson in sustainability. So this connection between marketing and sustainability is very, very interesting. That it can be also something that you get from an IKEA catalog. So we'll go now for the next presentation. And so I'm going to introduce Mariann Simon. Mariann Simon is an architect and professor at St. Istvan University, Faculty of Landscape, Architecture and Urbanism in Budapest. She is the co-author of the bilingual book, Family Houses. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the Hungarian, so I'll say the English one. Family Houses, which went out in 2009. Her collected essays about 20th century Hungarian architecture were published in the bilingual book, Restarts, which went out at 2016. She is the co-editor of Ideological Equals, Women Architects in Socialist Europe, 1945 until 1989, which went out at Routledge in 2017. So Sharon, can you open the presentation? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Professor Mariann from the Faculty of Landscape Architecture and Urban Design, Szent István University, Budapest. My term for habitation is standardization or standard design. Standard design or type design was a key concept of modern. Together with prefabrication, they were the precondition of mass production, i.e., the method that provides a shelter for everybody. The standard design was used mainly in mass house construction, but it was also present in family house design. The following I summarize about the 70 years of history of standard family house design in Hungary. I analyze the situation from the aspects of politics, architects, and the builder as the main participants of this play. I sketch the reasons behind the changing name that was officially used for pre-designed family houses. After the Second World War, architects who gained the leading position were either social democrats or communists, and all of them were the followers of the modern movement. They believed that adequate living conditions can be ensured via mass production, and mainly in the form of large housing estates. But they also realized that people should have a shelter as soon as possible. The newly founded Architectural Research Center launched a book about family houses as soon as in 1948. The authors listed the disadvantages of family houses, such as they needed bigger sites, longer roads, longer water mains and drains, involving bigger expenditures. But they also mentioned the advantages, such as quick construction and the possibility of gardening as a support for family. Against the limited material possibilities, the floor area of the presented houses moved between 19 and 140 square meters, and I suppose complete public works. Next year, in the spirit of the new cost reduction campaign, the first standard family house plans were published, so we arrived to standard design. The collection included only 5 freestanding single-family houses, 2 for the town and 3 for rural use. To meet the requirements, to be cheap but offer good quality at the same time, the floor area was reduced to 40 square meters, with a possibility of later expansion. The choice was narrow, but politicians and architects alike counted on mass housing. Politicians were wrong, so the government soon launched a private housing action. It offered a housing loan for the builders who could buy the standard family house plans cheaply. Well, the supply of the standard design was still low, so people turned to master builders or technicians who not only designed the house but also built it. Graduate architects all worked in state design offices and were overloaded with the official task. Consequently, to solve the problem of the low quality of family houses, they suggested elaborating more variation of standard family houses. The profession also suggested narrowing the circle of designers. This proposal was realized in 1958 when the ministerial decree excluded the master builders from the design of family houses, which were higher than one level. In 1960, the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party announced a 15-year housing plan. In this plan, they had already calculated with private housing activity at the rate of 40%. Also, the government intended to provide primarily to condominium buildings. The family house remained the main opportunity to create a home for people in the countryside. The Standard Design Institute, founded in the same year, soon increased the number of standard family house plans. The public catalogue presented 38 designs for freestanding family houses. In the first 5 years of the state housing plan, 150,000 family houses were built in the country, though standard family houses were still not popular. The architects again graded the new family houses obsolete and ugly. Their proposals were almost the same as earlier. More appealing standard plans should be prepared and popularized on several forms. They also added that condominium buildings or row houses would be more economical and would create a nicer settlementscape. While the architects stressed the wasteful use of traditional building materials instead of contemporary prefabricated elements, it was clear to the majority that many family houses were built on sites without public works, which excluded concentrated housing projects. To increase private housing activity, the Ministry of Building Affairs established the Own House Construction Committee in 1965. Soon, a new catalogue of standard family houses was edited, containing 22 designs. Compared to the early edition, the average floor area has increased a bit, and the pitched roof became dominant over the earlier tent roof. To enhance the design quality, the ministry launched a new decree, which further limited the design permissions of master builders and technicians, but which founded in each county an architectural committee for checking the quality of submitted designs. By the turn of the decade, it became clear that most of the family houses were built in the countryside. Recognizing this fact, a national design competition was announced for rural family houses, the first design competition in this site. The material became the basis of the 18 new standard designs for rural family houses, and we arrived to recommended design. In the last period of the 15-year housing plan, the government already realized that the state wouldn't be able to build a planned 60% of the 1 million flats, so the private housing construction should be even more supported. In the following years, expanding the range of designs, several counties announced an architectural competition with special attention to their environmental and landscape specialties. These competitions were popular also among architects, who had more free energy, parallel with the declining official workload, that is, with fewer state commissions. By the end of the 15-year housing plan, as a result of the intensive collection of family house proposals, already 230 designs were offered for the potential builders. These collections were named already as recommended designs. In 1980, a new regulation of private planning activity was introduced. The decree excluded technicians from the family house design, but let them adopt recommended plans. In the case of architecture engineers with a bachelor degree, the legislation prescribed 5 years experiment, whereas previously these two groups, technicians and architects with a bachelor degree, prepared the bulk of the family house design. The new restriction resulted in a radical increase in using recommended plans. By the end of the decade, and especially in the 80s, the distribution of recommended plans became a business. The state-owned Construction Information Center started to advertise the recommended plans in daily newspapers. The firm offered soon also a special version of family houses. The so-called Beautiful Home Plan System contained single-family house plans designed by reputed architects and offered a restricted number of uses. At that time, family house building was not the necessary evil for politicians. and was accepted also by the architectural profession. Well, parallel with the declining public investments, the government made possible to create small private architectural firms, which often accepted a commission for housing design and model design. The change of the political system in 1990 was followed by a radical decrease in public housing. During the boom of the previous decade, already 2 companies offered the recommended family house plans, but they both quit from the market for the millennium. By that time, it seemed that the supply, I mean architects, and the demand, family house builders, have been balanced, not only in capacity, but concerning also expectations of style and quality. However, the idea of a new family house catalogue was introduced in 2015. The government intended to facilitate family housing with abolishing the construction permission and with a cheap offer of pre-designed family house plans. The official explanation was to support building activity and parallel enhancing the quality of the built environment. The profession's first reaction was that the period of standardization had returned, but when the competition was announced, it attracted many architects. The National Model Design Catalogue was published on the net in 2020. The website is supported by the government and the EU Social Fund, and it offers a wide range of different situations and demands. The structure makes it easy to search between the plans, but, as the site itself stresses, the selected model design still needs adaptation to the given building plot. In short, the National Model Design Catalogue offers a general overview of family houses of the new century, like any other printed magazine has done it before. Arrive to the conclusion. The changing name of pre-designed family houses, standard, recommended, model, reflected the change in the approach of politicians, architects, and builders. Socialist power forced standardization in the spirit of regulation and economy. Architects, following the modern movement principles, also supported standard design, but not on family house level. When the government realized that they need private housing, they increased the number of standard design plans. Later, when the political power and the architects both realized that standardization had a bad connotation, they offered recommended housing plans. After the political change, builder became customer who commissioned the architects, so the relevancy of pre-designed family houses disappeared. Recently, the government developed the model design concept, which may help the potential family house builders in orientation and gathering information, but it can hardly provide the quality of the built environment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mariann. Who wants to ask something or to comment? Are there any comments or questions?
I have a question. What are the extents of the planning documentations that were supplied? We saw only basic plans and perspectives. So was it supplied with complete documentation, including details, construction details and all that? Or was it like a basic design scheme?
Mariann, you're muted.
Yes, I found the perfect push. So, well, it depended on a time. So when in the first 2 period, I mean in the 60s, I presented 2 catalogs and I worked from 2 catalogs then. you could find even the price. Yes, because the prices were fixed, and you could select from the catalog the project for yourself. But when you went to the authority, you could buy it for a rather low price, and then you received all the material you needed for a permission. And of course, you had to you didn't even have to submit the papers, that's the plans, only to give the number. So it was really easy. And later in the period of the recommended plans, you already needed the help of an architect who put the building on the given site. And so even this new model housing, unfortunately, I do not have any data about the rate of using these opportunities. For the previous decades, well, there are some contradictory numbers of whether some source gives 5%, then the other gives 20% of using this standard design, but nowadays we do not have any data.
Yes, Jesse?
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and I'm so glad to know about these documents. I was wondering, to what extent were these houses open for adaptation after they were built, and to what extent the stock actually remains as planned?
So, but adaptations, so you had the possibility to buy for a low price, and then you gave the plan to the builder. And after that, nobody followed what happens with that. So it was quite free.
So I could tell the builder, do a 72, but actually add another room in the back, like, or not?
Pardon?
I could tell a builder, you know, I choose number 73 in this catalog, but actually, can you also adapt this, and and I want my kitchen bigger, or no?
Yes, yes, you could do that. Okay. Unless the neighbor
complained.
Not against you.
And then afterwards, as time went by, are these houses, were they then, so that's one level of adaptation during the construction, but after living as they were lived in, were they also changed pretty dramatically, or not?
Yes, I do not have recent images about that, but about 10 years ago or so, I made photo series about them when the same type was built side by side on a row of a street, and then they were all different. So because the roof, the material for the roof was different, even the color, and they used different windows and different, well, entering places, so that's gates and so on. Just like in Venturi Scott Brown, Levittown.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Yeah. Sorry, can I ask one more question? I find this
of course.
really fascinating. To what extent, speaking of Venturi Scott Brown, to what extent was there a discussion of other kinds of these kinds of massive standardized construction projects, single house construction projects in other countries, you know, such as, you know, the American?
You mean during the 60s, 70s or so? Unless the standard family houses in the Soviet Union, standard family houses in Poland, in Czechoslovakia. So we never relied on Western countries at this period.
Okay.
In the 80s was already different.
Thank you.
For me, it was fascinating, your development of the idea that it started as a kind of standard design, then it's changed to recommended design, then it became a model. The way that there is this kind of players that are changing their terminology according to changes in time, but they're still very interested in being involved in the making of architecture. Now, I find it totally fascinating, but I have a very big question, because we saw that there is a kind of repetitive of a kind of a model of the gabled house, even when the architects are pushing for it, even when the government was like this stronger than the architectural milieu ability to change it, or were they interested in it and just thought it was the best way to do it?
Do you ask about the architectural opinion, the opinion of the architects as such?
Yes, and the way that they, in a way, continue to make this same image of what is a house.
Yes.
This is a...
Yes, it was that because it was always cheaper, at least at that period. I mean, the 50s, 60s, 70s, that's the pitched roof, because the water isolation.
Yes.
So that's why you hardly could find a house with a flat roof. That was more practical, and it more was accepted by the commissioners as well. So because later, I mean in the 70s and the 80s, this under roof extension was widely used.
And another question about it, like, as it seems, it was like a very big involvement of the government and the authorities and the architects in trying to make homes better. But you said that a lot of people choose not to use this opportunity. Like, was it like considered not good enough, not suited?
Well, one reason was that the architects didn't want to plan family houses, not only because they didn't have time for that, only in their spare time, in the nights, during the night and in the afternoon, they had time to do that. But they also intended to focus on larger scale products, buildings. But the other aspect, from the other aspect, especially in the first time, these houses were built in the countryside and in small towns, and there were no architects because half of the architects lived in Budapest. The number of half of the architects, they lived in Budapest, and it wasn't easy to find an architect there. So and that's why I also intended to stress in my paper that the architects first refused and were totally against building family houses, and then step by step they accepted.
More questions?
I just wanted to build on what Safir was just asking him, what you're answering, because I was really fascinated during the whole presentation, which was a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it, was kind of the role of the state in providing housing. And I find it really interesting, this idea of providing housing designs. But was this, I guess I just wanted to clarify a tiny bit, the role of the state. Was the state also funding the construction of the house, or was that up to the individual family?
Well, the state at the beginning didn't count it with private building. Then year by year, they had to realize that they can't finance all building activity. And then they intended to help people to do that. But they supported only in the small part of these family house buildings, because it never seemed to be their result. So it's, and even nowadays, there are very small help for people.
Interesting. So, no, please keep going.
Yes, that was, so yeah. It's sometimes we blame the so-called state socialism, socialist period with the low level of supporting housing, either on multi-level or either on family houses, but nowadays almost nothing.
Okay. Thank you, Mariann. And are there more questions? Okay, so we'll go now for the last presentation by Ariel. I will read his biography. Ariel Handel is director of the Lexicon for Political Theory Project and academic co-director of Minerva Humanities Center at Tel Aviv University. His research focuses on human mobilities in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the politics of housing and urban frontiers, gastropolitics, and the political philosophy of geography. Handel is co-editor of Normalizing Occupations, the Politics of Everyday Life in the West Bank Settlements, which went out in 2017. So Sharon, can you help us again? Thank you. And we'll see Ariel's presentation.
The term I chose to develop in my talk would be home demolitions. While much attention is given to the making of homes, their planning, design, building, and maintenance, less research has been devoted to their unmaking. Through a short theoretical analysis and a closer examination into the case study of the occupied, my contention will be to describe home demolitions is a relational process between various scales and forces. Let me start with a brief example. In 2012, the Jerusalem municipality decided to demolish Arab al-Korshan, a 4-decade-old Palestinian Bedouin village located within the city boundaries. In order to bypass legal obstacles related to home demolitions, a municipal bylaw on order and cleanliness was used, explaining that the shacks and tin structures inhabited by the village's 120 residents can't be defined as houses and must consequently be evacuated by force of the garbage disposal law. A few months earlier, the Israeli High Court of Justice ruled that 5 buildings in the Jewish settlement of Beit El had been built on private Palestinian land, and thus should be demolished. In an attempt to satisfy the Jewish settlers and their lobbyists in the Israeli parliament, the government had decided to saw the houses to pieces and in a complex engineering operation to rebuild them a few hundred of meters away on what is called state lands, which are not privately owned. While both attempts eventually failed due to legal difficulties and high costs, reading them contrapuntually, that is, one against the other, reveals an underlying rationale regarding homes and their demolitions in Israel-Palestine. While 40 years old Palestinian home could be treated as garbage, less than a 4-year-old Jewish home have already acquired an inherent value that exceeds the mortar and bricks, justifying sewing, mobilizing, and reassembling instead of destroying the old structure and building new one in the new location. It is the comparison between the Palestinian village and the Jewish settlement that exposes the context and politics in which one group's home is defined as dirt, while the others is treated as a sacred object. Homes are being demolished globally without a halt. They are demolished as part of urban regeneration. They are demolished to make way for highways and infrastructural ventures. They are demolished by war operations from the air, sea, and land. Destroyed because they were built without a permit. Demolished because they are not safe enough, or because the land value is worth more without the home than with it. Nevertheless, it might seem that architectural common sense suggests a reversal to Tolstoy's famous quote about happy and unhappy families. That is, treating standing homes as unique and having their own way, while seeing home demolitions as all alike. I will argue, however, that home demolitions are not all alike. Rather, we need to understand their unique appearance and effects by analyzing the demolition's contextual, political, and social significance. In their seminal study of home demolitions, Porteous and Smith define domicide as the deliberate destruction of home by human agency in the pursuit of specific goals, which causes suffering to the victims. While their influential work points up the myriad ways in which homes are destroyed in a variety of contexts, it still suffers from several shortcomings. First, it seems that Porteous and Smith's conception of home is overly simplistic. It is seen as a romanticized, sacred, and unproblematic place, thus creating a dichotomy of safe haven versus complete homelessness, with no account of situations in which the home is rather a site of violence, danger, or domination. Second, domicide emphasizes the demolition of the physical structure and not the socio-symbolic forms of destruction of homes. And then Porteous and Smith limited reference to questions of resistance and agency in the face of home demolitions is even more problematic, as in their account, the home's inhabitants remain in a state of passivity and victimhood. In another place, I have developed a critical theory of housing and dwelling that combined several philosophical backgrounds, from phenomenological dwelling, Hector network theory, and even Illich's vernacularity. The idea was to enable a relational exploration of the urge to dwell, the interconnections between human and non-humans, and the political and relational role of the home in certain regimes of power and knowledge. Together, those opened a set of ontological and epistemological questions for better understanding the studied phenomena. First of all, why do people build homes and dwell in them? Second, how those are built and dwelled? And then what does it mean to build a house or to make a home? While not being able to develop these any further in this short lecture, my contention is to argue that just as every home is part of a network of economic and state-made narratives, shared fantasies, and local know-hows and practices, so is the situation with every home demolition. Each demolition takes part in a complex political, economic, and top-down planning context, and it has an impact which is both personal and social. Thus, home demolitions should be investigated along three related layers. First, the housing, or rather the unhousing regime. The home's demolition is part of a broader system of planning, economy, and national goals. The second is critical phenomenology, that is describing the impact of the demolition by exploring both the ideal home images and the home's actualities. Third is the active dwelling, analyzing reactions to home demolitions as agentic and as part of homemaking as a political process. Sometimes a theory is best understood when it is performed. So I would therefore move now to perform some of the above mentioned ideas in the case study of Palestinian homes in the West Bank under Israeli occupation along those three axes: the unhousing regime, critical phenomenology, and active dwelling. Homes are demolished in the occupied territories under three main pretexts: demolition of illegal structures, punitive demolition by order of an army officer, and demolition as part of a combat operational action, sometimes in the midst of a battle and as part of its outcomes, at other times as a planned operation dubbed exposure in military jargon, referring to the opening of pathways for movement and observation and removing possible hiding places. During the 5-decade occupation, Israeli military rule has a major impact on nearly every aspect of Palestinian lives, including planning and housing. While extensively developing the Jewish settlements, Israel sets limits to Palestinian development and building. Aside of very few exceptions, Israel did not initiate or operate any type of positive housing policy for the Palestinians in the occupied territories. The policy is rather one of non-planning and de-development, which means, among other things, an almost total freezing of building permits. Various reports show that in the last decades, between 90 and 96% of Palestinian requests for building permits were rejected by the civil administration. As a consequence, tens of thousands of houses have been consciously criminalized, and the threat of demolition hangs over their heads without any real possibility for the residents to live a safe life in a stable home. Between 2014 and 2016 alone, just to give one example, 2,000 demolition orders were issued for what Israel is calling illegal construction. Nearly 1,000 of them has already been executed. Punitive demolitions are primarily intended to harm the relatives of Palestinians who were involved in terrorist acts, since in most cases, the suspect has not been living in the house, whether because he had been previously arrested or was killed during the act or after it. However, most demolitions were undertaken due to military reasons. Many were harmed as a result of actual combat and others as part of the strategy of exposure. Overall, according to data of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, between 1967 and 2019, 55,407 houses were demolished in the occupied Palestinian territories. While those numbers are striking, one has to remember that abstracting homes into numbers means also abstracting people into statistics. Hence, the need to go beyond policy and regimes of unhousing in order to get a sense of the meaning of home demolitions. That is, what lies in the home beyond its physical structure. Several researchers, for example, Brie Eckison or Christopher Harker, have made qualitative studies that show that Palestinians under the occupation define home as a site of family practices, a center of identity, and a place of protection, while at the same time, due to the permanent state of violence, surveillance, and control, also define the home as a cage and as a site of danger in and of itself. However, what is clear is that losing one's home doesn't entail breaking the cage, but rather a further exposure to danger and violence. The human significance entailed in home demolition is beyond the calculable. It is beyond statistics. For Palestinians, home is related to ancestral lands and to histories of longue durée, while its demolition is inseparable from collective traumas of loss and exile during the 20th century. Some of the consequences of home demolition are differently experienced by children, women, and men. For children, the permanent threat of demolition even when the home is still standing, the violent act of the destruction itself and the following loss of a steady place of living create an ongoing trauma. Signs of trauma and stress are common among Palestinian children, from bedwetting nightmares, fear to leave home, to dramatic drops in grades and school living. They are also more exposed to domestic violence that occasionally follows impoverishment, displacement, and humiliation. Palestinian women, for whom the home is sometimes the entire world, may experience home demolition as the loss of a loved one, as years of investment in the home under harsh conditions are destroyed with the house itself. Moreover, homelessness is experienced differently by men and women, mainly in traditional societies where gender roles are tightly related to social and spatial boundaries, also defining the personal and the political and public and private spaces. Men who are expected to provide secure dwelling and well-being for their families may experience home demolition as a psychological humiliation. Especially in rural areas, homes are still built on the family's land by the men of the family, even if sometimes with the help of hired employees. The home demolition is thus not only a loss of the physical structure and the investment of time and money, but rather also a loss of one's dignity and self and social expectations. Well, the 5-decade-old occupation has a clear effect on every aspect of people's lives. Reducing the Palestinians' essence into a mere passive victims of the control apparatuses would be factually as well as politically wrong. Building and dwelling in the Palestinian context can be understood as acts of subsistence and resistance. Sumud is the Arabic word for adhering or stubbornly standing. The insistence upon building despite the risk of demolition, and especially the rebuilding of demolished homes, has been considered throughout the years as one of the core features of Sumud. And one can draw a straight line between this practice and the memories of the ruined villages and of becoming refugees during and after the 1948 war. For Amal Jamal, the Palestinian home is existentially a homeless home, and its building and rebuilding are thus political acts of seeking stability and making a place in the world for the Palestinian people. Thus, in the words of Abdel Fattah Abu Srour, director of a cultural NGO in Aida refugee camp, Sumud is continuing living in Palestine, laughing, enjoying life, falling in love, getting married, having children, building a house, a beautiful one, and thinking that we are here to stay, even when the Israelis are demolishing this house, and then build a new and even more beautiful one than before. That is also Sumud. That I am here is Sumud. To reclaim that you are a human being and defending your humanity is Sumud. In a place where to exist is to resist, these struggles highlight the ambivalence of Sumud as a principle of steadfast communal survival, which paradoxically evokes a tragic sensibility that claims an ethical form of power through powerlessness, to quote Khalid Furani. And we can see how the small, mundane Sumud, meaning living in one's house, even if it is half ruined, is also a Sumud in capital S, the symbolic national narrative of making a place in the world, not only personally, but also collectively. To conclude, the home and the acts of its destruction and rebuilding are critical features in Palestinian lives by all means. Moreover, the case study has revealed the importance of thinking not only the global terms of habitation, but also the terms of unhabitation.
Thank you, Ariel, for the presentation, and I'm sure there are questions. Does anybody want to start? Okay.
And thank you. It was a really wonderful presentation. Very, very clear and thoughtful. And I guess it's more just an observation than a question. The paper that I gave, I was talking about a term that I think has some connections with Samud, which was home place. And home place comes, it's by bell hooks, and so it comes from African-American experience and the resistive nature of the African-American experience in creating a home. And what she talks about is home place, which she says, can be incredibly modest. So she talks about, really anything from the slave shack to, a very small dwelling. It's not about the dwelling itself, but this ability to self-constitute oneself and one's community, and about making oneself, forming oneself, and claiming oneself as a subject rather than object that's defined from the outside. And I just was really struck by, they're definitely not exactly the same thing, because there's different kinds of threats, I think, being imposed to each. She's not talking about something that's threatened by demolition, but something that's threatened by all that comes with objectification, particularly of the African-American person and family and identity and body. But I think that there's some really interesting connections there and parallels.
Yes, and thanks for this comment. Unfortunately, I didn't hear your lecture, but I think that it is very relevant. I mean, we know Virginia Woolf is only one example of a room of one's own as the basic condition for making political participation and to make full active lives. And I think that the idea of looking at house demolitions also as home demolitions, okay, not only as statistics, but also as the demolition of one's place of living and place of vita activa, okay, of making a place and dwelling in the deep sense of it. I think that it is very much related to what you were talking about. So thank you.
I might just go on for a second. I just wanted to, build up, because what I was trying to argue in my paper was I was looking at some South African cases and talking about housing as a type of resistance. So in those cases, it was the construction or almost kind of the recovery of housing as a type of resistance. But I think it's what I'm really struck by that you just said is this idea of it as a political act. And so this idea of, constructing a home, and I think that this is also where there's parallels. So constructing a home, knowing, sort of the impossibility of it, but then also, and then in the South African case, constructing a home as a way of claiming various types of political positions. These are all different types that I was expressing. So I think, I thank you for the paper.
I think that building, when you know that your home can be destroyed and then you rebuild it, is a kind of a performative act. It is a way of performativity because it is not stable, because you need to repeat it and to redo it again and again. The very act is as important as the thing that you are building. Okay, this is what I was speaking about as building as a verb and not only as a noun, to understand the very act of doing something.
Jesse, you want to ask? Yes.
Yes, I had a question. Thank you so much for your talk. It was fascinating and important, and I agreed with everything you said. I was just struck by the image you showed of the Ulpana Hill in Beit El. It seemed like, and I wasn't entirely sure if the two images were a before and after of the were they the house as it was moving? And it looked like it was prefab construction, like slab construction.
Well, I'm not sure about how it was. It wasn't constructed as a pre-made walls, but the idea was that instead of destroying the homes and rebuilding them a few hundred meters away, one should preserve the material itself. So actually they cut it into pieces. Yes.
Yeah, so that just struck me because because of the ways in which construction technology allows that now in a way, or the ways in which different, just thinking about Jewish, Zionist building traditions and Palestinian building traditions, and ways in which something becomes movable, whether it was intended that way or not. There's just the kind of technological history that was available in that photograph was just a striking offshoot of, I guess, prefabricated history in housing construction, but just a thought.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say something about what you said, Jesse. I think there is something which is because I taught architecture, and there is a difference in the way houses in Arab villages and so on are built, and the buildings in the settlements are built. There is this kind of which is interesting for itself, that this choice of using prefabricated parts and to assemble them, and not to do what is done in a lot of the Arab villages, which is to just, today, it used to be also concrete, but now because there are good insulation, there are this, not concrete, bricks, but now they are using they use concrete just to pour it. And then you have something very stable. It's like very stable, very hard to move. So it's interesting, this matter. But I would like to come back to the paper, which was very clear, and I think you really, in a way, explained the demolition as a term very, very strongly and very accurately. And for me, it's also raised the question, because we share the Hebrew also, and also there is the Palestinian side. There's also kind of a vocabulary that goes in the Palestinian territories and in Palestinian, in the Arab language, that deals with demolition. Do they have other words, like we say arisa, and we use it like for everything almost? Is there another way of like the tzumud is a kind of it was changed to something very specific, and is there something else to deal with, a term that they used to deal with demolition?
So actually, I think that this question is very good, and you asked me when you read the paper. So I went to do some fill-ins into the research. And actually, I'm now working on a new project of ruins and ruination in Israel and Palestine. And so I asked my partner, which is she's a Palestinian woman from Hebron, and she said that they have two words for that. But usually, but it's not that those words have many symbolic differences. So you have a harb, which is like in Hebrew churban. Okay, it is the same root, etymological root, and you have a had, which is another way of saying it. But she said that she doesn't think that people that use it, that they mean different things, or so I didn't find anything in that sense.
And also, I thought your take on demolition is also very interesting, because part of it is really demolition that goes through the practices of planning, for example, not giving planning permissions and so on. So it's a kind of there is a kind of let's say, a structural planning of demolition, almost like there is a structural planning for a building, which is, so is there also a kind of a thinking from the Palestinian side of how they can replan, as a kind of a resistance to the other replanning that they are experiencing?
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, going now into the history of the Israeli non-planning in the occupied territories would be too long for the time that we have now. But generally speaking, in the first 3 to 5 years of the occupation, Israel was looking to be a benevolent state in the occupied territories. And it suggested several major planning ideas to which Israel assigned its best planners and architects, actually, in the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 1970s. All of this ended around 1971, 1972. And since then, the policy is of what the NGO BIMCOM called non-planning. Okay, it is non-planning. It doesn't only say that we don't plan, it is non-planning as a policy. We don't want to plan, and we put difficulties to every attempt to make any kind of planning. Since the Oslo Accords in the 1990s and the division into areas A, B, and C, the construction restrictions are mainly referred now to Area C, in which Israel is controlling, which makes 60% of the West Bank. So actually in areas A and B, the Palestinian Authority is allowed to plan by itself, but because these are very small islands within an archipelago of islands, 165 islands within the larger sea of Area C, it means that those spaces are very limited. So even if you want to build a new neighborhood, you cannot do it because the borders of areas A and B are actually delineated around the already built areas. So this is part of the problem, that it means that although allegedly the Palestinians still have 40% of the place to build in, they can hardly do it because it is too crowded.
But is there also, is there also in the, let's say in the village itself, are there like, after demolition, like doing a kind of a planning from the authority, like local authority? I don't know if they can go on and build it, but do they do like a kind of a response to the demolitions? And
yes, definitely. It's hard to say how much it is effective, but every village, they do think collectively. Okay, how to rebuild? It's not something that is personal, but rather collective. And also, I can refer to the Hebron Rehabilitation Committee, the HRC, which is an NGO that reconstructs old houses in the H2 area, the area that is controlled by Israel. And when you read their publications, they see their project as something that is of a political heritage. Okay, it is heritage and political at the same time, because this is about conserving the Palestinian space.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, I would just want to add, or maybe expand, that this policy is not only in the occupied territories. So you have settlements like Al-Khiran that also are constantly demolished, basically, every few months. And the non-planning is also applied heavily to Palestinian settlements inside Israel. So it's not only an occupation policy, but it's an ethnical policy.
Yes, I definitely agree. It is done sometimes by different authorities, but the logic is quite the same logic that lies behind the two of them. What is recognized and what is not recognized, what is debris and what is a home. These issues definitely cross the green line between the occupied territories and Israel proper.
Two points on that. Not to be the person who goes back to the 60s, but it's interesting to me that actually in this kind of non-planning that you're describing, again, there's a very direct trajectory between, you know, there's a whole tradition of non-planning as an experimental form, right? And so what happens if this kind of non-planning of the 60s and 70s, which was, you know, the heralded avant-garde strategies, how does that, what happens when we tell the story starting there and ending where you are, right? Similarly with the non-planning and the prefabrication came at the same kind of moment, both technologically and theoretically, right? And so, you know, in a way, you can tell a story that starts in the most kind of canonic narrative of 1960s experimentation and end exactly with all the materials that you showed us today. And so that's just a thought that I was struck by as you're speaking. And lastly, on this point of language, I was interested if you could say a little bit more about how about the legal lexicon that you started with, talking about how houses would be of a particular type would be defined as garbage legally, which would allow for the removal. And so, just at what point does something become debris in making legally? And if that is an architectural terminology of use to us.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first point. The problem is that in Israel, Palestine, also in Israel, it's a very centralist way of planning. It means that non-planning meaning that you just cannot build. Okay, it's not about architecture without architects. It is about not being able to build at all because building without a permit is something that is illegal, and therefore the structure becomes demolishable at the same moment. Okay, so this is why I mean I thought it's clear, but you need to understand the specific settings of the place. And about the legal lexicon, well, there isn't one. So it's a part of how people make interpretation for they see. And sometimes you can see, and sometimes if you compare structures in the West Bank, okay, take some of the extreme Jewish settler outposts, which are as it's tents and caravans and shacks, but no one sees them as shacks, but rather as homes in the making, or I don't know, in some kind of a way that is different from how you will understand the same structure when a Palestinian lives there. And it's part of a legal colonial vocabulary in which you relate to some people as nomads. You see an inhabited land and call it terra nullius because you don't see the people. So I guess it's quite the same. The interpretation is part of the legal unofficial way of understanding place and society.
Thank you.
More questions or remarks? Okay, so thank you, Ariel. And thank you all of you for what was a very, very interesting and really invigorating session. I learned a lot. I learned a lot, and I also got to read the papers before, so I really learned a lot from this session. And we discussed a lot. Also, I'll just say a few words. I think the theme was representation. Yes. Ah, yes. Sure.
Sorry, I thought the question was about
No,
Ariel's paper. I actually have a question for all the papers together.
Yes.
I've been thinking about the theme of this session about representation, and then thinking also about, you know, all the other sessions we've had so far. And one of the things that struck me is, you know, representation is an act by someone or bodies. And so, you know, it has a deep amount of agency to it. And I just thought maybe something that might be interesting to think about all the papers together is sort of in each of the papers, whom has the agency and performing these representations, and maybe what's kind of embodied in that, or what's, you know, what gets produced through whomever is performing the representation. So whether it's, you know, architects, the state, not the state, I don't know if you wanted to sort of comment on that, because I think to me, I've been thinking a lot through the last few days about sort of not just who produces housing, though I'm, you know, really struck by yesterday's paper, Silke's paper about production versus consumption. Sorry, I lost my own train of thought. But yeah, so not just who produces the housing, but who sort of produces even the frame of what housing is and what housing does and how we think about it. And I think that representation is such a key component in that. So if anyone wants to comment on that.
So,
Yes.
so I would like to add something, because just before Sharon, I intended to tell you that when first I realized that my presentation will be included into a group which runs under representation, I was totally surprised. What should I do? How should it be connected to that? But now at the end of this session, it became for me quite clear, but I defined it for myself that it's the representation of politics, because especially after the Ariel really moving presentation, so it's somehow connected to politics.
Yeah.
Of course, I know that there was another group under the label of politics, but
Yes.
it's another aspect of politics.
I think that one of the most important thing that in a way connects the four papers is the fact that the representation is, first of all, you have, because it's a kind of a representation, there are several people, actors that are being represented and use this kind of thing. I think it was very strong in Ariel's presentation that you have the Israeli government, which is active in the making of the demolition in, like, I don't know how you say it in English, the verb for demolition, but and on the other end there is the Palestinian population, which is in a way taking the same idea, which is not by acting demolition, but in a way, let's say, translating it and speaking it. So I think that this is where these things happen. Well, there are different actors who are using the terms. I think the same was with your work, Mariann. I think that the idea that there is this kind of idea that we should have like standardized housing, which is totally an idea that government can control what's going on. And on the other end, there is this kind of a force that comes out from beneath that says, oh, but the standardization is not good enough for us. It's not well enough for us. And it works in a way sometimes, and the government then is changing the word, saying, oh, so this is the standard, and then they say, no, we're recommending it, and then afterwards they're going, oh, it can be a model. So I think this is also kind of this playfulness. It's not always a nice playfulness, but between actors, which is very, very important. And I also felt it with the idea of sustainability, because sustainability is a kind of also commodity that we're speaking about, and it's also became a word that's supposed to inflict good things, but we don't know if it's going there. And I think it was Marcelo did it very clearly, this idea. And again, with Jesse, I think the idea that you have this kind of looking, which I felt from really above, to have this kind of a solution for things that go underneath. The idea that you can take the idea of the grouping of things and from them get the solution for the problems of humanity. It's also a kind of there are several actors which are playing in this kind of show, and I think I felt that one of the challenges that now we have after this conference is to find how we use the words, like to be more accurate and more let's say precise. So more comments, if you have comments on it or other things, I would like to hear it. And are there any comments?
I'll just add maybe, I'm part of a research group in philosophy. Okay, I'm not an architect, and I'm not doing architecture, not practicing, and not I don't know how to hold a pen in my hand. But what we do is to conceptualize. It's called the lexicon for political theory. And I think that the idea to use words, to use concepts, it's a fascinating and very very important way of understanding what we do. Because sometimes when we need to delineate, okay, and we discover that any territorialization is also deterritorialization, reterritorialization. And then we don't agree. What is home demolition? What is building? What is market? What is representation? And this very effort of trying to think about the basic concepts that we use in every discipline, it's something that I joined the conference because I thought, oh, concepts, this is great. So it's just to say that I think that it's a very fruitful way, and I think that here, even these constraints of, I also found myself under a title representation, and I thought, okay, what are the relations? What would be the relations? Who am I going to speak with in the panel? And I think that it was very interesting, and so thanks for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, more comments or. So again, thank you very much for really 4 interesting papers and really invigorating, and I will have to think about them some more. We have also an announcement, Sharon. So the next, the keyword, the keynote. What did we decide at the end? I was in the morning. I was out of it in the morning. I was in the session.
Yeah, unfortunately, the keynote is canceled because the speaker is sick.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
so we've decided not to have it.
Yeah, so it's just so everyone knows not to come. I mean, I think from what I understand, the webinar, if you try to link into it, it just says that it has been canceled.
It's been canceled. So, okay. So
unfortunately.
So there's no, the keynote speaker is Ariel, so we're not having the keynotes, but thank you all again for really an interesting session, and see you tomorrow.
Yes.
Okay, so bye-bye. Goodbye.
Thank you for your wonderful hosting.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sharon, for helping me.
Oh, sure.
The Zoom gods were against me, and Sharon saved me. And also Jesse saved me. Okay, so bye-bye. See you.